Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Hope everybody is doing well today. I want to talk about one of my biggest problems with Pope Francis. People who watch the show consistently, not a caricature of me that you see from people on social media trying to dunk on me or something like that, but people who actually listen to what I say. They know that I call it how it is. If somebody is, lying about the Pope, misrepresenting him, if the media is doing that, I'm going to point that out and I'm going to say, look, actually, this is not what Pope Francis said. Here's another case where he's being misrepresented. And in this particular case, confusion is being caused by people misreporting and misrepresenting things. So I call that out, but people also know that I'm equally fair in calling out certain criticisms that can be made about Pope Francis whenever there are legitimate concerns and whenever there are problems that originate with Pope Francis and not misinterpretation, not a confusion at language, not the media, not people with bad will. I call it how it is. I try to be fair. If the Pope's being lied about, I'm not going to jump on board with that and start lying about him and use that as an opportunity to critique him unfairly. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to call it out. But if there is a case where he's not being misrepresented, he actually is being represented accurately, but the problem originates with him, then I will point that out and I'll say, look, this is where we can have some criticisms of Pope Francis. And maybe towards the end of the show, I'm going to talk a little bit more about when you can criticize the Pope versus when you can't, or rather, I should say, how we are to criticize the Pope in particular cases versus how we are to criticize them in other cases, magisterial instances versus non. We'll talk about that towards the end. So certainly stick around for that if you want to learn what the Catholic Church teaches about criticism of the hierarchy for a balanced take on that. But people know I tend to be balanced on this point. A lot of people aren't aware of that if they're not watching the show, if they're just kind of listening to what other people say about me. Well, at that point, they're going to get a position about me that's just simply not the case. But this is one of those situations where I want to not highlight where the Pope is being misrepresented. I want to highlight a point where I think that the Pope himself could do better, where the Pope himself is causing some confusion and where there are some criticisms of the Pope. And I'm just going to limit myself today to the biggest concern that I have with him. But before I talk about that specifically, I want to ask y'all hit that subscribe button. So many people who watch this show are not subscribed and y'all keep coming back, but you're not subscribed. Well, you know what? If you've benefited from the material, if you've been enjoying it, go ahead and do that for me and hit the like button too. Now, I try to be fair. So if you want to see instances where I'm showing that Pope Francis is being misrepresented and I'm defending him, hey, there's plenty of videos doing that. But if you want to see some instances where I'm critiquing him, there's also plenty of examples of that. And that's also what I'm going to limit myself to today. So this is going to be a critical stream about Pope Francis in charity, constructive in nature, not unfair, not slanderous, but hopefully something that is constructive. So, what is my biggest problem with Pope Francis? I think that in some cases, Pope Francis will make statements that are unclear, that are confusing in nature. Again, there are many cases where no, he's not being unclear. He's not being confusing. There's misrepresentation in the media. There's plenty of instances of that. But I'm pointing out there are some cases where that's not the issue. The confusion originates with Pope Francis. He's being unclear, and there's something confusing going on there. Now, in those cases, we know according to Catholic morality, we're supposed to give a person a favorable interpretation, the best that we can, at least. In fact, there's a burden on us to do that. I'll share my screen and just briefly show you this, where this is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. 2478 says, to avoid rash judgment, everyone should be careful to interpret insofar as possible his neighbor's thoughts, words, and deeds in a favorable way. And notice that qualification, insofar as possible, right? I mean, look, there's some cases there's just no favorable interpretation. It's just a clear-cut case. This is an error. And in those cases, you can't give a favorable interpretation. You need to call the person out in love and charity and with constructive criticism and ask them to abandon their error. But insofar as it's possible, we are obligated to give people the judgment of charity, to give a favorable interpretation. I think we all want that from other people. I can't tell you how many times I've been misrepresented because people don't give me a favorable interpretation. People do that, I'm sure, to you very often, whether it's at home with family members, whether it's at your job, a bit at your job. There's all kinds of people saying all kinds of stuff about you, and you know perfectly well they're misrepresenting you, and it's because they didn't give you a favorable interpretation. So we don't like it when others do this to us. So of course we don't need to do it to others. We need to treat others how we want to be treated. If we want to be given a favorable interpretation, we need to do that with others. It goes on to say every good Christian ought to be more ready to give a favorable interpretation to another statement than to condemn it. But if he cannot do so, let him ask how the other understands it. How the other understands it. So if you say something wild, and there's just no way for me to interpret this favorably, I'm supposed to ask you, okay, well, you said this. What do you mean by that? How do you understand what you just said? Repeat your order back to me, right? It's like we're at a drive-through, we're at McDonald's, I placed the order. Hey, can you repeat that order back to me? I'm not sure you took my order down right. I feel like you were distracted when you took that order. Can you repeat it back to me? That's kind of what we're doing here. How do you understand what you just said? Can you repeat that for me and in your own understanding? And if the latter understands it badly, let the former correct him with love. So if you get it wrong, let me correct it. If that does not suffice, let the Christian try all suitable ways to bring the other to a correct interpretation so that he may be saved. Okay, so the point is, we have to start with that. But in some cases, obviously, a favorable interpretation doesn't work. And we don't always have access to Pope Francis, right? So I can't always ask Pope Francis, hey, Pope Francis, what did you mean by this statement? I can't always do that. Now I can maybe look and see what he said elsewhere and try to figure out how he understands it in light of that. But I don't always have the opportunity to ask him a question, right? And therein lies one of the problems. Whenever you give Pope Francis a favorable interpretation, as we're obliged to do, in these cases where it's not that he's being misrepresented, it's that he is being unclear. When you give him a favorable interpretation, possibly by looking to see what he says elsewhere that helps shed light on the position. The issue here is that Pope Francis won't come out the next day and confirm the favorable interpretation. That's the problem. Now, he doesn't deny the favorable interpretation either, but he also won't come out and confirm it. Now, it would be the right thing to do would be if you say something confusing, people give you a favorable interpretation, or at least some do, and then others are completely slandering you and giving you an unfavorable interpretation and jumping the gun. For the sake of those who are giving you a favorable interpretation, it would be helpful if you came out and clarified and confirmed that favorable interpretation. I have seen him do that before, but it's pretty rare. I'll give you an example. With the case of fiducia supplicans and the blessing of homosexual couples, what he meant by that, I think if you give him a fair shake, you can know what he meant by that in the document, and it's not what the news was saying. And he did come out and confirm that correct interpretation of what he was saying, what he wasn't saying. He's talking about blessing persons, not the union. But it took him a while for him to come out and say that. That was part of the problem. He should have immediately said that. But that's kind of a rare case where he comes out and actually confirms the favorable interpretation. 9 times out of 10, he just won't say anything one way or the other. He won't confirm the favorable interpretation. He won't confirm the bad interpretation. Like he won't speak about it at all. That's not helpful. Can you imagine if I were confusing on this show and I said something that was so confusing that it just confused people on an international scale? And some people are just slandering me for it. Other people are trying to give me a favorable interpretation, but I just never come out and clarify that. That's not constructive. That's not helpful. It's especially not helpful for the people who gave me the correct interpretation, or I should say the favorable interpretation, which would be the correct one. Because I'm not going to say something wild and slanderous and ridiculous and heterodox anyway. So you get the point, though. It'd be insane if I don't come out and say, hey, here's what I meant, especially if I'm aware that I caused this massive amount of confusion. If I said something and people interpreted that to mean that I think Hinduism is what you should practice. You should practice Hinduism. Leave Christianity and go to Hinduism. Like, let's say that that's what people took away from something I said. Oh, you better believe I would come out the very day that controversy erupted, the day of the controversy, not tomorrow, not the next day, the day of that controversy. And I'd make it very clear, no, I'm not telling anyone to leave Christianity to go to Hinduism. I mean, it would be addressed like that. Unfortunately, with Pope Francis, most of the time he doesn't do that. And that not only makes some people feel like, well, gosh, we sure could use the support here. We could use some reinforcements here. We're trying to defend you. But it also makes some people feel like, well, I don't know if I should give him the favorable judgment since he won't come out and confirm it. Some people feel like, well, maybe he didn't mean it in a orthodox way. Maybe he meant it in a heterodox way, and that's why he's not saying anything. Some people are going to feel that way, and he's not doing enough to dispel them of that perspective and to reassure them of the orthodox interpretation of whatever he said. So it kind of leaves them hanging too, and it makes them in the future feel like, I don't know if I can give them the judgment of charity. Now, I'm not saying that that's the right approach, but I'm just saying that that's how a lot of people are going to feel if they're giving them the benefit of the doubt, giving a favorable interpretation, and he doesn't come out and confirm it one way or the other. People are going to be less likely to want to do that in the future. Again, I'm not saying that's right, but that's how people are going to feel. Additionally, though there is an obligation for people to give someone a favorable interpretation, we clearly just saw that. That is there. The problem is the burden needs to be on the speaker to be clear. Sorry, I'm coughing over here. There is an obligation on the hearer, the interpreter, to give a favorable interpretation. But the burden is on the communicator, the person who speaks. The burden is on them to be clear. Unfortunately, when it comes to many of these instances, the burden ends up being shifted onto the hearer, shifted onto the faithful, where they now have a burden to interpret Pope Francis favorably, and he doesn't come out and reinforce the favorable interpretation. And he doesn't seem to make a whole lot of attempt to be clear in the future, to do better in the future. That's not right. The burden should be on him to communicate clearly and effectively. The standard shouldn't be that most of the time or many of the times you're unclear and people have to give you a favorable interpretation. No, the standard should be 99% of the time you're clear. And every now and then, 1% of the time you say something off the cuff that wasn't very clear and you have to come out and correct it. I mean, Look, hey, that's everybody. That's me. That's everyone. Most of the time, I think I'm pretty clear on what I'm saying, but every now and then, I've had to come out and say, actually, no, a lot of people misunderstood me on this point. Let me explain. But that should be an exception. That shouldn't be the norm. With Pope Francis, it seems like the exception is him actually being clear and coming out and clarifying what he said. That's the exception. The norm tends to be a lack of clarity when it comes to these controversies, at least. A couple examples of this that we saw in the last few days that I tackled: his statements about all religions are paths to God. We've seen a favorable way to interpret that from Nostra Aetate, from um, Ratzinger and the CDF, and from Acts 17, and a number of authoritative resources. We've seen a favorable way, but the problem was he didn't come out and clarify that favorable interpretation, and he should have. I mean, we just saw just a few days ago massive confusion erupted from some of his comments. And yes, there's an orthodox sense in which we can understand them, but he never came out and confirmed the orthodox sense. In fact, he doubled down and offered more confusion. That's where, no, he should have came out and said, hold on, here's what I meant. First of all, he should have said it right to begin with. That's the first problem. But if he doesn't, at least come back and make it right later. Don't come back and double down and be even more confusing. It's not helpful. It's not helping anyone. That doesn't help his critics, and that doesn't help those who are on his side. That helps nobody. So we saw that with all religions are paths to God. We saw that with the controversy yesterday. Religious diversity is a richness from God. We saw a way in which that could be interpreted favorably in some kind of orthodox sense, but it wasn't the sense that he gave. And that's part of the problem. You should give that sense to begin with. He doesn't. So we look for an orthodox sense to it, but he doesn't come out and confirm the orthodox sense. That's the issue. And he should. This is one of my biggest problems with him. He should. He should have been clear to begin with. But if you're not, at least do the right thing later. Don't double down and make it even more confusing. At that point, it's doubly on you. It was on you to begin with because you weren't clear. Then it's on you a second time because instead of clarifying, you made it even more confusing. It's doubly on you at that point. This is one of my biggest issues with Pope Francis. We saw this whenever he made certain statements about he likes to think of hell as empty. In his as a meditation exercise, he likes to think of hell as empty. Oh, okay. I mean, I can understand. I mean, who wants to think of hell as populated? No, I don't know anybody in their right mind who wants anyone to go to hell. So I understand the sentiment, but obviously in an age, in an environment where a lot of people are denying the reality of hell, that's going to be understood not as some kind of meditative exercise, but as a doctrinal statement. And it doesn't matter that you literally prefaced what you said one sentence before with, I'm not making a doctrinal statement. Doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter because that's how it's going to be perceived in a soundbite environment where people have no attention span. They don't listen to things in context. It's going to be misunderstood. Well, maybe for some reason he didn't. Okay. But come out the next day and clarify. Right. Now we know elsewhere Pope Francis has affirmed hell. He's affirmed the reality of hell, the eternality of hell, that people are in hell. Like he's affirmed those things. But I got to go to other statements that he made to properly interpret him. And I have to go to something elsewhere to properly understand it instead of him providing that clarity up front to begin with, or at the very least, the day after the controversy, maybe the day of. That would be helpful. Like again, going back to the all religions are paths to God. I've shown where Pope Francis has explicitly said over and over and over, multiple times, even very recently, that Jesus is the only way to salvation. We've seen that. But then he says other confusing things that on the surface don't appear to be compatible with that, unless you give some very qualified um, nuance to it. It just doesn't appear to be harmonious. And yeah, I can go to other places where I can kind of get a better feel for what he said, what he's attempting to say here, and see that he affirms Jesus is the only way to heaven. But first of all, I shouldn't have to. It should have been clear to begin with. In whatever statement you make, that should already be clear. You should already be balanced in the way you communicate. But even if you're not, okay, come back the next day and clarify. But he doesn't. That's not helpful to people. We saw this with the Scalfari statements, some of the Scalfari statements. That was an atheist reporter and journalist who didn't take notes, would often paraphrase, and would misrepresent sometimes the Pope in whatever interview they had. And he would have the Pope saying stuff like, hell isn't real and things like that. And, the Vatican would usually come out the next day and say, that isn't what he said. And Scalfari doesn't take notes. But then two problems. Number one, Pope Francis continues to go back to him. Well, if he misrepresents you, don't keep going back to him. Number two, it's not good enough to just say, hey, the Vatican say, hey, he was misrepresented. Pope Francis was misrepresented. You need to come out and say, but here's what I did say. And here's what I meant. Don't leave any doubt here. Like, okay, Scalfari has me saying that I'm denying the reality of hell. And the Vatican comes out and says, well, no, that isn't exactly what he said. Okay, come out and say what you actually did say then. That way there's no confusion. That's the problem. There's a lack of clarity here. Now, elsewhere, maybe a few weeks after that, he'll go and talk about the reality of hell. But most people aren't paying attention at that point, and it's not going to get that much media coverage. And the storm has kind of died down, and in most people's minds, the Pope just denied the reality of hell, and that's all they know. Like Joe Rogan, that's all he knows. Pope Francis denies hell, and that's it. He doesn't know where he elsewhere affirms it. So it's not good enough to come back later and affirm it. You need to clarify then. We saw this also with the case of him saying all God wills the diversity of religions in the Abu Dhabi statement. He came back and clarified in a general audience much later that he's referring to the permissive will of God. Okay, that's orthodox. That's fine. That's perfectly scholastic and orthodox. Goes back to Damascene. I don't have an issue with somebody saying in God's permissive will, he allows for the diversity of religions. Yeah, sure, of course, God's sovereign. But the point is, you come and clarify that way later in a general audience. Most people aren't going to hear about that. And most of the people who are confused to begin with aren't going to hear about that. There should have been a clarification that day or the very next day, some kind of press conference where the Pope gets on camera and says, hey, here's what I was attempting to articulate. That would go a long way if he just did that. Just get in front of a camera, say, hey guys, here's what I did mean to say. He doesn't do that. You have to wonder, okay, well, why doesn't he do that? Is he just really not being very informed about the impact of some of his statements? Well, we've seen some evidence of that, by the way. We've seen some evidence of how oblivious he might actually be to how some of his comments are being perceived on an international scale for a number of reasons. I don't think it's excusable, but we have seen that before. But then we've also seen some instances where he is aware of how his comments were being perceived. So it's not entirely clear cut. And we'll take a look at a few examples of that here in a moment. But again, I want to remind y'all, hey, hit that subscribe button. If you're just now tuning in, go ahead, hit the subscribe button for me, hit the like button for me. I'd greatly appreciate your support, especially if you've been benefiting from the content on this channel. Please take a moment to go ahead, hit the subscribe button. Okay. What kind of effect does this problem that I have with Pope Francis have on the faithful? Obviously, it causes massive confusion with the faithful, right? So that shows that there is a difficulty here in being a clear communicator, which is why I said yesterday, I think Pope Francis is not a clear communicator. I don't think he's an effective communicator. Um, Maybe in some cases he's sufficiently clear, sure. Maybe you could even say, hey, generally he's sufficiently clear on a point. All right. But the problem is the instances of a lack of clarity are more frequent than they should be. Um, Everybody needs to be cut some slack. Everybody misspeaks at some point here and there. I totally get that. I go live almost every day, so I of all people understand that. But it happens more often than it should with Pope Francis, is what I'm saying. That causes a lot of confusion to the faithful, causes them to lose confidence. I want to give you an analogy. I want to show you something real quick. I'm not going to play long from this clip because I'm sure I'll get a copyright strike or something for it. But let me show you a quick, very brief clip from The Hobbit. Watch this. All right. Some of y'all are like, okay, some are saying, hey, there's no sound. All right, let's try that again. Let's try it again. Hold on. Bear with me. Let's do it again. All right, let's go through it again. Some of y'all are like, what in the world's going on? Why are you showing this? I'll explain. By the way, I love Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. I mean, great movies. I've watched them over and over and over. And what I noticed in the movies, that was just one quick clip, an example of it, but there are many others. You will see these war signals with horns. The way they will coordinate the armies is through certain signals, visual signals, certain flags, certain horns. If the horn sounds this way, the army knows to go this way. If the horn makes that noise, you know to go that way. If the horn does this, you know to retreat. If the horn does that, you know to attack. And this is pretty common in warfare. This is obviously not just Lord of the Rings. This is actual warfare. Particular sounds, flags. They tell the troops what to do. Now, what happens if there's confusion in these war signals? The guy who's holding the flag isn't really clear in what visual signal he's giving, or the guy on the horn isn't really clear with what kind of noise he's making. How will the army know what to do? How will the army know, okay, do I attack? Do I retreat? Do I go to the left? Do I go to the right? I don't know. And if there's confusion, you're going to have the army being confused. This is actually a point that scripture itself talks about. Share my screen so that you can see this real quick from 1 Corinthians 14, 6 through 12. Now, brethren, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how shall I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? If even lifeless instruments such as the flute or the harp do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? Right? If that horn that's supposed to tell you get ready for battle, if it's not clear, how are people going to know, hey, do I get ready for battle? Are we on lunch? What are we doing? So with yourselves, If you in a tongue utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? For you will be speaking into the air. There are doubtless many different languages in the world, and none is without meaning. But if I do not know the meaning of the language, I shall be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker of a foreigner to me. So, with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. Okay, so obviously he's talking about in the context of speaking in tongues, but the point is still the same. If people are unclear on what you're saying, people aren't going to know what to do. If the army is unclear in what sound the horn is making, they're not going to know what to do. Same thing with Pope Francis. The faithful, they're like an army ready to go out and spread the good news. But when we look to our shepherds to tell us how to go about doing this strategically, and the shepherds are not clear, the army's going to be confused. If there's an indistinct sound from Pope Francis, we're not going to know what to do. Do we go left? Do we go right? Do we back off at this point? Do we attack? What do we do? This is one of the problems if you have someone in leadership who is not an effective communicator. It causes the troops to be confused and to be ineffective. And it might even cause them to lose a battle. And I feel like we've been losing a lot of battles lately. And there's a lot of reasons why. And it's not all because of Pope Francis. There's a lot of reasons why. But, you know, in cases like this, Pope Francis doesn't help. And again, it causes some people to just say, well, you don't speak clearly in some of these cases. You don't come out and clarify. Well, it's going to be hard for me to give you the benefit of the doubt in the future. Or some people will even be discouraged. You know, I saw a lot of people, my heart broke for them in the comment section because it really resonated with me. I saw people saying things like, I've sacrificed a lot to be a Catholic. And you know, if he's going to give people the impression that it really doesn't matter what religion you are, you know, it's all a path to God, then why did I sacrifice so much to become a Catholic? And it's like, I understand, because I sacrificed a lot to become a Catholic. A lot. Some of y'all know about some of those instances. Others, most don't know because I don't talk about, you know, all the things, but some of y'all know about some of them. So I totally understand. People feel undermined at that point. They feel like, why did I leave that religion and come to Catholicism? If this is the case, I lost family over this. I lost jobs over this. I lost, you know, this and that over this. It causes a lot of hurt. And instead of coming out and reassuring those people that, hey, you made the right decision, the leader doesn't say anything. That causes a lot of people to be hurt. And that's understandable. And people, again, lose then confidence in their leader who doesn't come out and reassure them, you did the right thing. Now, maybe some people are going to say, but well, you don't need that reassurance from Pope Francis. You already know you did the right thing according to Scripture. It's true that you could know that without Pope Francis telling you that, of course, but I think the problem is you shouldn't have to resort to that strategy. Your leader should be clear enough to come out and reassure you. You know, if I, as a father, don't come out and reassure my children about certain things, maybe they can know the truth on their own without me, but I, as a father, should be the one leading them to the truth and reassuring them. So in reality, people shouldn't have to look elsewhere. Their leaders should be doing this to begin with. Now, I do notice, again, some examples where Pope Francis doesn't appear to be aware of massive controversy surrounding some things that he's involved in. Example of that was Pachamama, which, yes, he was very much misrepresented on that particular point. I've gone into that in great detail. But I also simultaneously pointed out to people Pope Francis was also not very well aware of how confusing that ceremony was because he straight up told us that. He said in a book interview way later, somebody asked him about it, and he was like, I had no idea people were going wild about this stuff outside of the Senate halls. We were wrapped up in what's going on with the Senate. I had no idea the world was basically on fire, confused on this particular point on what happened in the Vatican Gardens. And I'm just thinking, well, gosh, you should have been aware. And how were you not? So I don't think it's excusable that he wasn't aware, but it's like, well, I guess that explains a lot. I guess that explains a lot why you didn't come out and clarify some points, and instead you even use the term Pachamama, undermining your own position by using it. And so it's kind of like, well, no wonder, because you're not aware of the effect that your presence at a ceremony can have, how things are interpreted. You're just not aware in some cases. In some cases, that was one of them. In other cases, he is aware. He is. I'll give you an example of that. I called it out at the time, and I said, in the case where Pope Francis had those comments towards the gay community, using a particular word that I can't repeat here because YouTube will probably try to shut me down if I use the word. But it rhymes with a maggot. It rhymes with that. It starts with an F. When he used that term twice, by the way, he immediately came out. I think it was the next day after a massive controversy from the world. Like, the world was really upset that he dared to use a derogatory term towards the homosexual community. And he came out and apologized for it the very next day. I think it was the next day. That or the same day. One of the two. It was right around the time. In that case, he was aware of the effect of his words and came out and clarified people and assured them he wasn't intending to be derogatory towards the people in the gay community or dismissive of their human dignity. Okay. We can do that in those cases. But in these other cases where we needed to offer clarity, much more quickly and more effectively, like the Pachamama case or Fiducia Supplicans and others, we had to wait a while to get clarity. Why is that? Well, whatever the reason is, there's no reason that's excusable. So this is not a sign of an effective communicator, in my estimation. An effective communicator, at the end of the day, at the very least, should be able to come out and clarify in a timely fashion, not a year later. Now, be that as it may, this does not justify many of the critics of Pope Francis. I'm going to again call it like it is. Just because there are some cases where Pope Francis is confusing does not mean that he's always the source of the confusion. In fact, many times he's not the source of the confusion. A fair amount of time, he is. Many times, he's not. A lot of times, it's the media, bad will critics, all sorts of people. And that needs to be called out. And they can't use these instances to say, see, we've been telling you all along. No, you've been lying in many of these cases, and you're still not justified by them. And you're just not being balanced. I actually attempt to offer a balanced perspective, and this isn't new. I've been doing this for a very long time. Ever since I stopped bashing the Pope, I've been offering this balanced perspective. If there's a favorable interpretation, I forward it to him. If he's being lied about, I'm going to call that out. But if the problem is ultimately with him, then I'm going to address that and criticize it in a constructive way, sure. But I'm going to do it nonetheless. So this is nothing new. I saw some people making silly comments like, well, even Michael's having to, criticize the Pope on this. It's like, where have you been? I've criticized the Pope for years. What are you talking about? What it is they listen to caricatures of me from other people rather than what I actually say. Now, I want to briefly cover the question of when can you criticize the Pope? When can you criticize the magisterium? How do you do so? Maybe offer some general thoughts here. And perhaps I'll do a more in-depth show on this in the future and go through some magisterial documents and cover it in more detail. But before I do that, I want to remind y'all, hit the subscribe button. If you're just now tuning in, go ahead and hit it for me. I've been telling everybody before to hit the subscribe button, but we got a lot of people joining the stream in the last few minutes. So yeah, go ahead, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button for me if you have benefited from the content on this channel. Okay. There are two extremes when it comes to this situation about criticizing the Pope. I'll see some people who will say things like, the Pope is always wrong, and they'll always criticize him no matter what he says and does. And you know what? That's a ridiculous position. That's not fair to the Pope. I'll see some other people on the other extreme, and they'll say you can never criticize a Pope. And it's like, yeah, actually, that's not a Catholic position. The magisterium itself says that you can't. Neither one of those positions are accurate or what the magisterium teaches. They're both untenable positions. We gotta find a happy medium here. Now, there obviously is going to be a difference when it comes to criticism of magisterial statements versus criticism of non-magisterial statements. Let's talk about that. When it comes to the case of magisterial statements, things that are authoritative in nature, there is an obligation to assent to them at various levels according to the authority invoked, but yes, an obligation to assent at the very least with religious submission of intellect and will to the proposition provided by the magisterium. So there is an obligation to assent, even if it's not the conclusion you would have arrived at, even if you don't understand the reasons for it, even if you don't agree with the theological reasons for it. Dona Veritatis is very clear. The obligation to assent is still there. There's some very rare cases where that can be dispensed with, but it doesn't apply to the vast majority of instances for the vast majority of people. If you want to know about those exceptions, Dona Veritatis goes over them. But the rule is you assent whether or not this is the position you would have arrived at or you even agree with theologically. It does, however, allow for criticism in that case, though. You can assent to a proposition while still criticizing it. So, for instance, I can say, I accept this proposition. I accept the truthfulness of the proposition, but it wasn't phrased well, as much as it could be. It wasn't very timely. It might be a true statement, but I don't know if this was timely. Like what we're dealing with here with Pope Francis on religious pluralism. There's some orthodox ways in which we can understand what he's saying, but first of all, you need to be clear on those senses, not leave us having to figure that out. And then number two, the timing is still an issue, If we're in an environment where a lot of people are confused about salvation in Jesus, timing, yeah, you know what? This might not be the best time to highlight some of this stuff. You got to consider that as well. So though I might assent to the proposition, I still want to say, but wait, timing is an issue. Now, in this particular case, what Pope Francis said wasn't even magisterial. I'm just saying, even if it was, which it wasn't, but even if it was, you could still assent to the proposition while questioning the prudence of the timing of the way in which it's articulated. So even when it comes to magisterial propositions that there's an obligation to affirm and you can't just outright dismiss, you can still constructively criticize them, and you can even do so publicly, according to Canon 212. Now, dissent, like I'm going to reject this magisterial proposition. No, you don't get to do that according to Dona Veritatis. You never get to do that. You never, privately or publicly, you never get to do that. Canon 212 doesn't allow for that. Dona Veritatis doesn't allow for that. There are, in fact, are things in the magisterium that explicitly prohibit any kind of public dissent of a magisterial teaching. So criticism is not the same as dissent, because I can accept an assent to a proposition while still criticizing it. What I've noticed is some people don't seem to operate at a wavelength in which they can see that those two things are compatible. I've noticed that if you ever tell people you can't dissent, they think, oh, that means you can't criticize. It's like, yeah, no, that doesn't logically follow. Dissent and criticism are not the same thing. We got to go a step above from some of this stuff. We got to think a little bit harder about this stuff instead of these knee-jerk reactions. But criticism doesn't amount to dissent. So just because you can criticize in a constructive way doesn't mean you get to dissent. They are not the same thing. Now, in the case of non-authoritative, non-magisterial statements by, say, the Pope, obviously there's no obligation to assent to what they're saying. There's no obligation. It's not binding on my conscience. But there still is the principle that you need to give the person a most favorable interpretation, even if it's not magisterial, because you just need to do that with anyone. That's just the proper way to discourse and understand and interact with people. If we don't have that, we really have no basis for any kind of meaningful interaction. If we're just going to be bad-willed with each other, first of all, that's a sin according to Scripture. Second of all, we're never going to get anywhere. If there's not trust, there's no foundation to move forward then. But though we are to give, again, that favorable interpretation, we could still say, I don't have to assent to what that person says if it doesn't make sense. And you have a lot more room to criticize, not just by saying, hey, this wasn't timely. You could even say, hey, this is wrong, if it's in fact wrong. So there's a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to outside of the magisterium. And hopefully that helps explain some of the differences. Again, that's just a quick crash course. Obviously, we can go into that in much more detail, but hopefully that gives people a little bit of information to notice, or to see how we are to deal with magisterial propositions versus kind of off-the-cuff statements by the Pope that aren't authoritative. Let me grab some of these super chats. Vincent says, did you see that the second case was addressed to a group of Catholics from around the Mediterranean? It seems that from the context, he may have been talking about different Catholic religious traditions. No, I don't believe that's the case. When I looked into it, it was an interreligious group, for what I understood, at least according to what was reported to me. So if that information was misreported, then please let me know. But that doesn't appear to be the case from what I saw reported. And then number two, that doesn't even make sense contextually, to be honest. Because we're not talking, if we're talking about Catholic traditions, we're not talking about religious diversity. So that doesn't even make sense. But hey, if you got, something that shows that that's absolutely what the context was or something, hey, send it to me. I'd love to see it. Thank you for the super chat, by the way. Thank you, Matthew Schmidt, also for the super chat. We all have Protestant friends. Let's spend more time evangelizing than analyzing. I appreciate that. Antonio, thank you so much. Vaticano said 3 days ago that going against synodality is a sin. Some people consider the church as creating new kinds of sins. Can you comment? Well, that's absurd. That's not new kinds of sin. What is meant by that is a couple things. Number one, it could be exactly what I was just referring to here moments ago, and that is if you're just automatically dismissing and giving a poor interpretation to somebody, there could be a sin there because you're not being favorable to them. Number two, I think what's meant here by the synod is not that the synod is itself authoritative, but rather it is a consultative body of the Pope, and you don't want to immediately dismiss it. And that will have impact ultimately on his magisterium whenever he gives a post-apostolic, post-synodal apostolic exhortation. And you can't immediately just dismiss that. There certainly could be some sin there. So that's how I would understand it. I think it's quite an absurd claim to say that the church is inventing new sins here. I mean, obviously that's not the case. I think if we did exactly what we just saw there from the catechism, try to give a more favorable interpretation, we would avoid some of these silly claims like that. I appreciate it, Antonio. Thank you so much for that super chat and question. Ramses, there's a quote from a video game, "Hate me, but do it honestly." While we shouldn't hate, if we have disagreements with anyone, it shouldn't be dishonest, which I see a lot from critics of the Pope and RNG. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see it all the time with people and how they treat Pope Francis, and of course, how people treat me as well. If you have a disagreement with me, okay, that's fine. But number one, accurately represent me in doing so, and then number two, show me why I'm wrong. Don't just tell me I'm wrong. Show me why I'm wrong. It's easy to say somebody's wrong. It's a lot harder to actually show that they're wrong. But 9 times out of 10, when somebody disagrees with me, it's not because they're actually disagreeing with me. They're disagreeing with a caricature of me, and that's just not fair to me. It's not fair to anyone. And I could do that to people all day long. I could misrepresent people like that too. Um, but I don't. I attempt to represent people fairly, no matter who they are, whether they deserve it or not. So, anyways, thank you so much for that, Ramses, and good to see you've been a member for 31 months, channel member. That is awesome. Thank you so much for supporting the show for so long here. Good to have you. Okay, scanning through the chats very briefly. Let's see if there's anything else. I don't see a lot of chat, but I was looking to see if there was some questions. Gardenia says repent. We all need that, right? Repentance. Mahoville says the main issue is that we have been trained to react on every and to look for problems. This is only in the church, but this is not only in the church, but elsewhere. Sure. Yeah, I agree. This is something we see everywhere. So yeah, that's very, very accurate. Tony says context is not only what Pope Francis is saying today, but together with what he said yesterday and the day before. And forward. Yes, and that's true. You always want to take a person in context in light of the whole of their thought. But as I was pointing out earlier, though that's true, you shouldn't require people to have to do that excessively. You should be sufficiently clear enough yourself to where they don't have to constantly do that. Dozan, thank you for the super chat. I think that for the average layman, it is a big mistake to study every pope's word. Most people do not have the knowledge or intellect to independently interpret pope's teachings, including me. Yeah, fair enough. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Okay. Josh says, my sister trying to use Francis's recent comments to discredit the Catholic Church, which she believes is the same class as Mormonism. Yeah, so what this does is it causes people who are already of bad will and are critics of the church, it just gives them more fuel. It gives more fuel to the fire for the critics of the church, whether they are outside of the church or whether or not they are somehow external members of the church, so people who are technically in communion but internally they left the faith a long time ago. A lot of those Catholic critics, it gives more fuel to them. It gives fuel to, well, he's no longer even formally in communion, but Vigano, it gives fuel to your Viganos of the world. It makes them feel justified, and that's part of the problem. You don't want to do that. You don't want to let your enemies feel justified. Michael, do you think the context of the gathering in Singapore is important to understand the Pope's thoughts? Sure, but that doesn't remove from the difficulties. But yeah, discussing interfaith dialogue, yeah, but that doesn't remove the difficulties. So I think I demonstrated in the stream just a couple days ago what the difficulties are, and so that doesn't remove the problem in my estimation. Okay. Alex says he's a pope, not Jesus. He does not speak in parables. He speaks a modern vernacular language that ought to be plain and clear to an average layperson. Well, I do think that if you're going to be the leader of a world religion, and if you want to be effective, in shepherding your flock, you do need to be a clear communicator and speak to people in a way that the average person can understand. Yeah, I think that goes without saying. And if you don't have that quality, then it seems like a necessary quality to fulfill the function of your office is lacking. Is ecumenism consistent with Vatican II? Properly understood, yes. Depends on what we mean by ecumenism. Certainly not indifferentism, if that's what you mean by ecumenism or relativism. But that's actually not how the magisterium would interpret ecumenism or define it anyway. Ecumenism is going to be working on good relations with people um, outside of the Catholic Church, especially other Christians, working on good relations with them for what point? Yes, we could talk about to help society, but ultimately to bring them back to the unity of the church. That's according to the church itself, the goal of ecumenism. Should laity send their complaints to their priests in a constructive way? I think that would be helpful, sure. And if the priest gets enough complaints, they send them to their bishops. You can try it. Wouldn't hurt, right? Definitely be respectful, but yeah, it wouldn't hurt. People need to hear that people are confused. They need to hear that feedback. Um, let's see. All right. Well, I think I grabbed everything. Did the Pope come out with another statement similar to the last? Well, I covered one yesterday. So if you're referring to the statement similar to the one a few days ago, yes, there was one yesterday. So maybe go and check out yesterday's stream. All right. Well, I think that's it. We're at the 1 hour mark anyway, so we'll go ahead and end it there. I hope this was helpful to y'all. Please let me know if it was. Put that in the comment section. Hit the like button, subscribe, and also consider supporting me at patreon.com/reason and theology. Or just right here on YouTube, hit the join button, join at any participation level. You'll get access to plenty of extra content for patrons only. So whether it's here on YouTube as a channel member or Patreon, either way, you get access to the same material. So yeah, consider supporting me at either one of those so I can continue to do what I do here, continue to provide this content to you. So if you have found it beneficial, take that extra step, beyond the subscribe button, consider supporting the channel. All right. See y'all tomorrow. God bless.